Welcome, everybody. It's 5:45 p.m. Eastern, so it's time for Belt of Truth Live at 5:45. We are live with hopefully some people joining us because we're going to engage with comments, questions with our special guest, Dr. Wes Youngberg. Before I introduce him, though, I've got to I don't know if it's just me, but after last week's program, don't you guys all have that beautiful music in your head? I'm going, take me, O Lord, as wholly thine. I lay all my plans at thy feet. Beautiful music. If you missed that episode, watch the archives with Christian Paul. Such wonderful music and a great testimony. Next week, we've got, by popular demand, Dylan McWilliams coming back. Presently, he is on the front lines distributing those Bibles in Ukraine. Pray for that brother. What powerful miracle stories we heard last time. And we had some technical difficulties at the end, as those who follow our Belt of Truth Live are aware. But we're going to be doing a review of the things that we couldn't get at the end, and then the latest stories from he'll be coming back by next Wednesday. So that's next week's Belt of Truth Live. We go live every Wednesday, 5:45 p.m. Eastern. So our guest today, I'm going to introduce. He's an esteemed medical practitioner, researcher, professor. Dr. Wes Youngberg is a practicing lifestyle medicine specialist and clinical nutritionist in Southern California, and a friend. And is one of the founding directors and the first fellow of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, the fastest growing field of medicine in America today. And he was one of the founding directors of that and the first fellow. He's an assistant clinical, medical, and public health professor, has authored several books, which we're going to be telling you about. You will not want to miss out on that. And they're called Goodbye Diabetes, Memory Makeover, How to Prevent Alzheimer's and Reverse Cognitive Decline. Now, we're talking in this interview about lessons learned from COVID. And I want to bring up Dr. Wes Youngberg and welcome him to the program and say, you know, we've been working together for a few years. We had the privilege of putting out an appeal, a statement to religious organizations saying, let's get this right at this crisis hour of Earth's history, to be a witness on liberty of conscience and on reason and on being thinkers, not mere reflectors of other men's thoughts. And Dr. Youngberg, I know you've spoken to the loss of trust in the medical profession, in the public health institutions of the federal government. And I want to hear from you on that. I want our listeners to learn how to be thinkers first and foremost. And then we'll get into, hey, what did we get right? What did we get wrong? How do we learn? How can we all learn and say, you know what, let's do things differently next time on this point and that point. But first of all, what is there a crisis of confidence? And how'd that come about? And how do we navigate that as individuals?
There is a huge crisis in confidence. I just bent over to bring up a document I just printed out a few days ago. It's a Gallup poll from this past week, looking at how the American public in general is looking at institutions, and the confidence in institutions, the places that we used to hold a lot of confidence in, has gone way down. Has just crashed over the last couple of years in particular. So much so that it's interesting, Scott, the area of institutions where there's the most public confidence right now is local government. And guess what percentage of Americans have a great deal of confidence in the area that they have the most confidence in, the local government? 21%. Okay, that's the best that they could do right now. Now, if you go all the way down, the legislative branch, which you can kind of understand now, as if anybody's been keeping up with the news, there's a crisis of confidence in the legislative branch where right now, only 4% of Americans actually have a great deal of confidence in the legislative branch. And then the media drops all the way down to 8%. Now, of course, my biggest concern is that all institutions have taken a big hit. Churches have taken a big hit. The confidence in church leadership has taken a huge hit across all denominations. I remember talking to Catholic friends of mine who, during the COVID crisis, and they go like, "That's not my pope. And even though they were Catholic, they just said, I'm not going to follow what he says about this because it's clearly wrong. I'm not my Pope. I had Latter-day Saints colleagues and good friends of mine. I played basketball. They said, hey, the president of our church, he's not my prophet because I have no confidence in what he's saying right now. And so this is a big challenge that I think all mainstream churches really, from a leadership standpoint, they listen to the wrong tune on this, unfortunately. But there's an opportunity to regain confidence. And that's really my main message is that, for instance, I got some things wrong at the beginning of the pandemic. I remember, lessons learned. I actually bought in to the mathematic modeling that occurred early on early in 2020 in January and February, where top institutions like Los Alamos National Laboratory, like Johns Hopkins University, like Imperial College in London, they were all coming out with this amazing presentations or computer modeling that said that tens of millions of people would die from this new scary virus unless we took drastic actions, essentially prepping us for giving up all our rights and freedoms just so that we would survive, right? So they created a state of fear. And of course, at the time, I knew that some viruses can be quite deadly, right? And so I chose to actually believe them. In fact, I didn't even consider that they were actually not telling the truth. Okay, and of course, they were just, whatever model you create, you can create a model, say anything you want, right? And so I started immediately. I was an early adopter. I said, hey, we got to pay attention to this. Many of my other colleagues were going like, oh no, don't worry about that. It's not going to be a problem. But I immediately started asking the question. As a public health expert and professional, I wanted to have an answer for my patients, for the people I speak to. What do we do about this problem? So I recognized that there could be a problem. Okay, I overstated the problem based on the research I was initially looking at. Okay, but then what we got right, Scott, was we initiated a treatment or an early treatment strategy that went completely against what all the agencies were saying, what the NIH, the CDC, the WHO, etc. All these agencies were saying, just go home and take Tylenol or whatever, and only go to the hospital if you have a hard time breathing. That was the treatment plan. Now, that was the most egregious mistake that was made during COVID, is that anybody that knows anything about medicine knows they should have known at the very beginning, like Dr. Peter McCullough did. He was a conventional cardiologist. He didn't have my training. He didn't know anything at the time about all the things that I was saying. Okay, but he was intelligent and had integrity at the level that he went outside of his comfort zone, which was conventional cardiology, and he started asking the question, what can I do for my patients right now? What early treatment protocols? Because early treatment, of course, is always the goal. You never wait for somebody to get sicker. That's ridiculous. And so that's how you knew that we couldn't trust the agencies early on, is because they weren't making any sense at all, and they were basically making guidelines that completely went against every public health guideline and clinical guidance guideline that we had previously. So that's how you know where you can trust somebody or not, is are they making any sense at all looking at our past, what we've known. Those of us that had already 35 years of experience clinically, we knew what to do, even though we didn't have any specific studies on COVID necessarily or SARS-CoV-2 necessarily. We knew that viruses generally respond in a similar fashion to treatment. And the biggest problem, Scott, was that the agencies essentially were saying, hey, this is a viral problem and we don't have anything for viruses. The only hope is waiting for that vaccine. Of course, that was entirely untrue. For instance, one of the things, and I can actually show you here in a minute. I can share a screen, a presentation that I did in Camarillo, California, on February 16 of 2020. Okay, and I'd already been presenting this at other churches, even 3-4 weeks earlier than that. That I was out. Okay, here's the problem. This is what we can do about it right away. What was interesting at that presentation in mid-February 2020, one of the people that was in the audience emailed me a day later and said, he says, I have a good friend who's a general in the Pentagon, and he is asking for your PowerPoints. And I remember thinking, what in the world is the Pentagon? Why would they care about this, right? I had no idea what their connection was, right, early on. And so, of course, I just shared it with them. And so, but one of the things that I shared, one of the things that we learned, okay, in fact, maybe I can actually show from that very PowerPoint. I don't know if I can do that right now. Let me see here. I'm going to go ahead and share screen.
Jeremy's doing the mute back and forth thing so that there's not the echo. Thanks, Jeremy. And Dr. Youngberg, I happen to know your local church benefited from this early advocacy for a healthy immune system, for prevention, for treatment. And I had the privilege of speaking at your church the week after you had just presented on one of these things. And they were telling me about all this great information. This was the very end of February 2020. And I think you were giving vitamin D out, right? And so as you get to your slides and finish the comment about the Pentagon and what you were presenting there in February, I want you to speak to vitamin D and some of the basic things that have been known. And then also, I know I'm asking you to multitask. How many of your church members who listened to your advice and applied it died of COVID?
Okay, so let me see here. All right, so let me actually let me actually before I share screen, let me go back to not sharing screen. There we go. Let me answer your question directly, because this is powerful. One of the things that we did at our church, I talked to our senior pastor at our church and say, hey, listen, we need to educate our population, because we have a very similar population as any other church has. I know, because I as a doctor, I had many of the parishioners were my patients. And so I was treating lots of people for diabetes and heart disease and hypertension, et cetera. And so we have a very similar population. And so I said, those are the individuals that are the highest risk of succumbing to any viral infection, but in particular, something that is more challenging, right, to the immune system. So I said, can I make some presentations during the church service? He goes, like, absolutely. In fact, Wes, he said, I want you to do a 10-minute presentation right before my sermon. Kind of so everybody's already sitting down waiting, that they're gonna have your attention, and or you're gonna have their attention directly. So we probably at least twice a month we did presentations for 2020, 2021, and I would do little handouts and so on. One of the things that we did early on is I knew that vitamin D was going to be one of the biggest issues. Now, at the time, we had 0 studies on vitamin D and COVID. And so a lot of people, the critics out there would say, they would say, hey, Dr. Youngberg, you can't be talking about using vitamin D for COVID because there's absolutely no research on that. And they'll go, well, are you asking me to completely, to avoid addressing all the research on how vitamin D dramatically impacts all other viral diseases, including most respiratory diseases, right? So, or respiratory viruses in particular. So I knew that there would be a strong connection. Of course, now we're fully vindicated. The new studies, well, even as of 2021, the studies looking at the Delta strain of COVID, those individuals who had a vitamin D blood level at least 50 nanograms per milliliter, basically, even though they had diabetes, obesity, and all the comorbidities that was strongly associated with a dramatic increased risk of death due to COVID, if their vitamin D level was above 50, their risk of dying from that Delta strain of COVID was essentially zero. Okay, and it was even in the title. It was so dramatic. The title of the study showed it was near zero. In other words, the comorbidities were really not the main risk factor. The main risk factor was the deficiency diseases that are most typically associated with those comorbidities. So the comorbidities were actually confounding variables. They weren't the real cause of the problem. Okay, so just simply optimizing vitamin D. So, for instance, when I look at, of course, I'm one of the elders at our church, and so I was there on a regular basis, and we were doing these programs. Not one of our members who came to church regularly, not one, ever died of COVID during the entire time. Now, one of the, once in a while somebody say, well, Wes, there was one of our members who died of COVID, and I go, excuse me, but I know that case intimately because I had previously been one of his doctors, and I was working very closely with his wife and with him, and the reason he died was not because of COVID. Okay, I actually quizzed them very carefully during their illness and afterwards. The reason he died is because his doctor, his primary doctor, had placed him on Eliquis, a blood thinner, and I can't blame him. That's actually, if he had COVID, being on a blood thinner is a reasonable thing to do. However, he maintained that blood thinner, and about a week after he had completely recovered from COVID and he was home for a whole week, he had a brain bleed in the morning while eating breakfast. That's why he died, not of the COVID. So my point is that even the simplest strategies that were followed worked really well. So what we did at the very beginning of COVID is our clinic actually gave vitamin D to every family, a bottle of vitamin D liquid to every single individual, family member at that church. We just handed it out. Okay, we even had people from other churches showing up and say, "Hey, could we have a freebie as well?" And so that was a huge factor right there. Now, there's actually several other simple remedies because we could talk forever and we only have a few minutes to address this. Okay, but if basically what we learned is we need to have these simple remedies available. First of all, we learned from the Spanish flu 1918 pandemic that there's 4 key things you got to do. If you don't have any access even to simple remedies, okay, number one is you gotta really rest. If you're sick, you gotta rest. And if once you feel better, you gotta rest another couple of days. That's what saved many people's lives, is that they just rested adequately, and that's where most people didn't do well. Okay, number 2, you got to eat very sparingly when you're sick. Your body can't heal if you're ordering food coming in, you're eating all this junk food while you're sick. Yeah, that's what actually increases the likelihood that you're going to die from that infection. Okay, and then you can do hydrotherapy. This is another thing that we did at our church in early February 1 of 2020. We did a 90-minute YouTube presentation showing how to do hydrotherapy, where you basically do hot fomentations with a towel that's been wet or moistened and then heated up in a microwave and put on the chest and on the back, and you do 3 minutes hot, 30 seconds ice water on the chest and the back and forth, 3 minutes hot, 30 seconds ice. That hot cold contrast 3 times dramatically enhances the immune system. It activates the innate immune system, which is the problem. In the first week of getting COVID, your innate immune system is not working. It's like it's on R&R. It's not paying attention to these viruses replicating. And so you need to do a hot cold treatment to wake up the innate immune system, which then can now start fighting the virus and get rid of it. So just doing hydrotherapy alone can make the difference between life and death with so many people. So here's my point of telling you this story, is that within a few days of that video going on YouTube, it was taken off YouTube. It was not only censored, but it was completely deleted. We didn't even have access to it anymore. And so our IT director at the church, he challenged YouTube and said, hey, you know, this was a video on hydrotherapy, man. Come on, we're just trying to help the community. And they responded saying this was taken down because it was promoting violence in the community. And I remember, you know, I mean, I was stunned. Like, what do you mean violence? This is like promoting massage and being told that you're killing somebody, right? And so at the time, Scott, I did not have the faintest clue of what this really meant, other than it was ridiculous, right? But it was about a year later that as I started understanding the new vernacular, you know, everything was changing. The definition of words were changing. And I realized that anything that goes against the narrative, right? In other words, the only thing at the time in early 2020 that people should be looking to cure or address the problem of COVID was the vaccine. And anything that even suggested that there was other beneficial solutions, okay, especially if they were curative solutions, that they were actually seen as hate speech. Okay, because it went against the narrative. So that was the definition. You go against the narrative, we'll call it hate speech. And hate speech by definition in their terms is violence. And so in other words, if you disagree with anybody that's in a position of authority, okay, or even anybody who's in a position that has a more common view on something, you're actually promoting violence in the community, and you could potentially be penalized somehow for that. And we know other countries that's definitely happening. So those are some of the early things that I learned early on in the pandemic.
I remember when they finally squeezed out of Dr. Fauci a comment on vitamin D. It was kind of like, yeah, I guess you could do that. And you just said if you've got your vitamin D levels over 50, there's virtually zero chance of dying of the Delta strain, which was the worst. I enjoyed that one. I think you did too, right? And I had the fatigue for a week and I rested. I did the hydrotherapy. I took a lot of vitamin D. I ate like just fruit and that's it, and just rested and then rested and rested more. It never touched my lungs. So praise God, we have these remedies, these natural remedies, but it's unconscionable that there is not even a vaccine yet at that point in 2020. And you're shutting down any conversation about things that can help save people's lives because of the coming one golden solution. That's mind-boggling to me. And then how did the vaccine push? How did that actually turn out? Lessons learned from COVID. And it's not a judgment of anybody who took it or anybody who made a medical choice that they felt was best for them. But as far as assessing public health authorities and the trustworthiness of them, I remember hearing over and over again that you ought to take this, even if you don't think you need it for yourself, because you're going to prevent infection and transmission of the virus by taking the vaccine. How early on did we actually know that was not true? Tell us about the Cleveland Clinic research, particularly about that.
Excellent. Okay, I actually have this slide up right now. I'm going to go ahead and share screen, and I'm going to play that. Can you see that?
Not yet, but I bet you, Jeremy. Yep, there it is.
There it is.
Okay, all right. So this is a study published in the Open Forum for Infectious Diseases, and it was entitled effectiveness of the coronavirus disease 2019 bivalent vaccine. Now, this is actually the second study that was done. Now, I'll show you in a second what they were addressing. Okay, so I'm gonna actually go to this here. So this is the Cleveland Clinic, the second most elite medical institution in the world. Okay, and they had about 50,000 employees that they employed, right? And I remember talking to one of the managers at the Cleveland Clinic, actually a friend of mine, and I was told by them that the Cleveland Clinic never wanted to mandate the vaccine, but most of the institutions that ended up mandating the vaccine did it because they had basically the hands tied behind their backs. They had been told by the federal government and Medicare in particular that if they did not mandate the vaccine, Medicare would not pay them anything that they owed them. And of course, as you know, if you know anything about healthcare at all levels, okay, all healthcare clinics and hospitals and institutions, they get about 80% of their funding from the government insurances, the federal government insurance, Medicare, etc. And so they were basically being told, we're not going to pay, you're not going to get 80% of the money you're owed if you don't mandate this vaccine. So they gave in to that because they didn't want to basically go under financially. But to their credit, the Department of Infectious Diseases at Cleveland Clinic and other similar, and the Department of Qualitative Health Sciences, etc., they did a study on 48,000 of the employees that had taken the vaccine or chosen not to. And what they basically found was here. Just like in the general population, about 25% of their employees said, no, we're not doing it, and we don't care what you say, we're not going to do it. You can fire us, whatever, we're not going to do it. Of course, the ones that said that say, hey, well, we'll work with you, we'll try to give you some type of exemption, etc. And so a lot of the demands initially were bluffing. They were just trying to get everybody to do it. And so comparing the 75% of their population, their workforce that were ages 18 to 64, and against those who had taken the vaccine versus those who had not, this is the chart. Now, what you see here, let me interpret it real quick. You're seeing that with every single additional dose taken of the vaccine by the employees, each dose increased the risk of that individual getting COVID later on by roughly 100%. So much so that if you'd had 3 or more doses of the vaccine by the time this study was published, there was over a 300% greater risk of that person getting COVID later on. So this whole idea of safe and effective is, it was based on magical numbers that weren't true. That was very, very, very clear. Now, of course, immediately the fact checkers, right? The fact checkers. Here's Dr. Christopher Lobos, right? A physician who said the Cleveland paper does not say the bivalent booster increases the risk of catching COVID, but rather that it reduces infection by 30%. There's something amazing about, quote, the well-educated fact checkers, that they're able to use facts and twist them in a way to make you believe something that the facts did not say. Okay, so the bottom line is what I told you is true, is that the risk of people getting COVID later on dramatically increased. And of course, that's the real key problem. The other main message that we're learning, okay, is look at the summary here. This is interesting. This is from the September 2023. They said, among the 48,344 working age Cleveland Clinic employees, those up to date on COVID-19 vaccinations did not have a lower risk of COVID-19 than those not up to date. And then they said the current CDC definition provides a meaningless classification of risk of COVID-19 in the adult population. Now, that was a weird way to say it. So they were asked to say it, the way most people normally talk. And so they said those not up to date on the COVID vaccination had a lower risk of COVID-19 than those who were up to date. Okay, so bottom line, okay, is that the CDC said this idea that we're being told that the vaccine actually prevents infection and prevents transmission. Of course, now we know categorically that was all made up. Okay, it was never known to be true, so they should have never said it was true in the first place. Okay, but they acted like it was true, maybe hoping it was true, but it definitely was not true. Okay, so that was the key. The key. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing screen now.
It's unconscionable that the mandates were based entirely on that premise. That was never known, as you said, because it wasn't for the person's own benefit that you mandate something. That's about their own choice. It's because the virus is going to stop with every vaccinated person, the mainstream media said. What are some of the public health authorities saying now? People like Offit and Redford, are some people humble enough, reasonable enough to say, here's where we got some things wrong?
That's one way that we can start healing from the massive distrust that America and the world over is experiencing against institutions. The public health institution. Who's going to trust them now, right? I mean, I am a public health specialist, and I don't even trust the public health system, right? I mean, that's pretty bad, right? So can you trust doctors? Can you trust public health professionals? Can you trust the directors of the different agencies? Now, there's some healing starting to occur, but we have a long way to go on this. And so, for instance, Dr. Paul Offit, who's one of the top vaccinologists in the world, and certainly in the U.S., who sits on the FDA Advisory Council for vaccination. I remember hearing him in an interview with the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Medical Association. This was in 2020 still, during Operation Warp Speed, where things were being developed at the speed of science, which means they were occurring outside of the normal guidelines of science, which means it was actually really bad science. This is what it was. Very, very bad science, and obviously very unsafe, and created a lot more problems. We would have been far better off if no vaccine had ever been created. No question about it. Far, far better off if no vaccine had ever been created, and we just focused on early treatment. You know why? Because as Dr. Peter McCullough and many other doctors have noted over the last couple of years, there's all kinds of amazingly effective simple remedies and natural remedies for any viral illness, including COVID-19. Okay, so, and whatever comes next. So Dr. Offit, in his interview, he said he was raising the issue. So he was raising the issue of, I'm really concerned about this vaccine, he was saying, because, the previous studies on animals have not gone so well. A lot of animals have died. And the big problem of why there's never been previously a vaccine for coronaviruses in general is because or COVID viruses like this is because of what's called antibody-dependent enhancement. Essentially, what was happening in the animal research that they had been doing after SARS-CoV-1 occurred about 11 years earlier, that these animals would actually develop all these antibodies from the vaccine, and the antibodies, rather than neutralizing the virus, they actually enhance the ability of the virus to infect the cells. I mean, you can't make this up. And so that's called antibody-dependent enhancement. And so these are exactly the type of antibodies you never want to have in your body, because they actually make you worse. They actually act more like toxin vectors. So I was listening to Dr. Palofit talk about this with the Journal of American Medical Association. I'm going like, well, that's a big, big, big problem. Okay, and so I'm thinking maybe he's going to vote, be at least the minority objector on the vote with the FDA committee in the next couple of months, right? Well, no, he ended up like everybody else, 100% unanimous voted to approve the vaccine. I'm going like, well, that was kind of like, that didn't make any sense, right? And so I was already concerned about that. And then when we learned from the Cleveland Clinic study and other studies that the real problem is not just that you're more likely to get COVID. That's actually not the big problem. That it is a problem, but the big problem was why? Why would you be more likely to get COVID? And the answer is because you're more likely to get any infection. In other words, the main concern right now is that those who got the vaccine are immunocompromised. Okay, there's a lot of people that think that AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, is only related to HIV. That's completely false. HIV is only one possible cause of AIDS. There's all kinds of potential causes of acquired immune deficiency. And now we're realizing, based on many of the studies, that the vaccine is creating a form of AIDS, of acquired, okay, it came from the outside like a vaccine, okay, immune deficiency syndrome. And so now other studies, and I have all these papers. I got 100 studies all around my desk right now. I don't have time to look at them and show them, but they're basically showing, Scott, that the concern is that there's a suppression of the p53 cancer suppressor gene. Now, the p53 cancer suppressor gene, when working properly, suppresses cancer. That's exactly what we want. So we want to encourage the p53 gene to suppress cancer properly. But studies are showing that those who got the vaccine are now more likely to have suppression of the p53 suppressor gene, which means the very gene that's protecting you against cancer is now not doing its job very well. It's also true for the BRCA1 cancer suppressor gene for breast cancer, ovarian cancer. So, I mean, I'm hearing so many people at very young ages that are otherwise very healthy and living a healthy life are coming down with cancer. And I'm very concerned. And so we need more research to show what's going on and what can be done about this. But the main reason I'm talking about, and I'm more adamant about this right now, is because there's a new booster out there. It's like the public health system has not been paying any attention to all the science on this topic, and they're continuing to promote this new booster, this mRNA booster. Now, to your point, Dr. Robert Redfield, the past director of the CDC, who took the mRNA vaccine himself and promoted it to his patients early on, he's saying now, says, I will never give an mRNA vaccine. Now, to be clear, in his case, he's recommending the Novavax, which is a protein vaccine. In other words, it's giving a set amount of spike protein, and that's it. Whereas the mRNA vaccine, you have no idea how much spike protein that's going to generate production. No idea. And we actually don't have any good idea right now of how long that goes on. It can go on for many, many years. It could go on for a decade. We don't know. Okay, that's just a really, really bad thing. And then we find out from multiple studies and multiple researchers that most of these vaccines actually had DNA plasmid contamination, which is associated with how the mRNA is produced in the first place. But instead of the regulatory authorities making sure that these manufacturers get rid of the DNA plasmids before they put it into a vaccine, they apparently didn't do a very good job of that because they have all this DNA plasmid in it. And that means it could easily get into the DNA, to get into the nucleus of the cells, and basically create a spike protein factory for life. Okay, so that brings us to strategies. And I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time here, Scott, to talk about strategies. By the way, Dr. Paul Olfett, he went on record over a year ago that he didn't think the boosters were necessary anymore, except maybe for the elderly, the above 75 or 70. And of course, I would say, number one, they weren't shown to be that effective. They weren't shown to be safe, and they were actually shown to increase the risk later on. So we're better off not doing that at all, and we're better off paying attention to what we already knew before COVID even came available, of using simple and natural remedies.
You answered my next question. My next question was going to be, why don't we just move on from this? And, I get that impulse from many Christians who, some of their brothers in Christ obviously went the wrong direction on this, and you want to save face and not shame people. And that, I get that that's a good impulse, but that's not the motive, obviously, of Dr. Youngberg to gloat about, where those who question the public authorities, health authorities, got this right. But I want you to speak to that. But first, this is a short live. Belt of Truth Live is like an hour, right? Dr. Youngberg was just this past weekend at a church where he had the morning message and all afternoon. And email me, folks, scottritsema@gmail.com. We asked Dr. Youngberg, can we promote your YouTube? He doesn't really do much on YouTube, but do check out his books. They have a wealth of information. And Dr. Youngberg, that's not the topic tonight, on diabetes. Maybe we'll have to talk about that another time. But he was one of the early, writing the template, literally wrote the book on the topic of how to reverse diabetes, and getting scoffed at. But by the way, that's going to be in the video I'm going to post. I didn't finish the thought there. scottritsema@gmail.com. Email me, and I will send you the link to the 4+ hours of content from Dr. Youngberg from this past weekend, where you're going to get a whole lot more of what he's not getting into here, including amazing stories about vitamin D, about diabetes, more about how corrupted the scientific process and the agencies are in our day. And so I think what we need to hear next from you, and I'm glad you're trying to transition to that, and folks, line up your questions, because strategies for those who took the vaccine, who are hearing this and going, boy, what do I do now? But I do want to encourage folks to listen to more than just this 1 hour. Email me at scottritsema@gmail.com. Say, can I get the link to the Dr. Youngberg message? And that'll be on our YouTube channel, probably tomorrow. And we'll get that link right to you via email. But you were going to get into strategies and also address that question of, why don't you just move on? You could talk for the next 2 hours about vaccine injury, about the problems and complications. You mentioned to me autoimmune conditions. You mentioned the cancer and the basically immunocompromised people who've received a deficiency in immune function, AIDS. That was a big aha moment. Talk to us more about strategies, about complications, and about why don't we just drop the subject and move on.
By the way, I never talk down to somebody who's had the vaccine. I always, when I work with patients, I always ask, listen, what was your experience with COVID? And we discussed that a little bit. Okay, because frankly, and you can post this link as well, Scott, about 1.5 years ago, I did a 7-part series called The Rise of Immune Dysfunction, Autoimmunity, Blood Clotting, Diabetes, Dementia, and in association with the COVID infection and in association with the COVID vaccine. So I want to be clear here. I am not one of those that say, oh, COVID was just like the flu. Okay, it may have felt that way for some of us, but it is going to have much more lingering negative effects on us than we realize, especially if we're not fully eradicating the virus from the body. One of the big problems that is right now only seen in those who have long COVID, which is about 20% of those who got COVID, is that the COVID virus can actually infect certain bacteria in the gut, like E. coli, for instance. And E. coli, even though it's quite considered to be the bad bacteria, a little bit of that in the gut is normal, and the immune system doesn't try to eradicate it. So if the COVID virus infects that bacteria, it becomes a bacteriophage, and now you have a scenario where that virus can live forever in your gut. Okay, and it can raise its ugly head whenever you're stressed, or you're not sleeping well, or you're eating not so healthily during the holidays. Hint, hint. And so forth. And so these viruses in the bacteria stimulate the bacteria to produce toxins 24/7. And so that's why we don't have time to deal with all these natural remedies right now. But that's why it's important to have charcoal in your home, in your medical cabinet at home. Powdered activated charcoal is really, really critical. Okay, for instance, I had a patient, an 11-year-old patient from Mexico City, and her mom was beside herself because she'd gotten COVID in 2020. Okay, and it was really bad. She had bad symptoms. Her daughter didn't get any symptoms at all, but then a week later got diarrhea. That's the only symptom, diarrhea. And about 5 days later, she was really fatigued and still had bad diarrhea. They went to the clinic. And an astute doctor immediately checked her blood sugars, and they were over 900. Okay, in other words, that 11-year-old girl had developed type 1 diabetes. The virus had destroyed the cells in their pancreas that make insulin. Okay, and so now this ties in with what you said earlier about the vitamin D. For instance, okay, if that young girl, if her mother had just given her vitamin D on a daily basis for months prior to that, she probably would have never gotten type 1 diabetes. Okay, and I'm not just making that up. I'm saying, based on my clinical judgment, with my 35 years of experience and all the studies that I've read, I am near certain that she probably would have not gotten type 1 diabetes had she had been vitamin D replete. Okay. Now, the other point I wanted to make on this is that if she'd had charcoal available when she first got the diarrhea and start taking charcoal will bind the viruses in the gut and remove them. And so she could have dramatically decreased the viral load early on if she'd had charcoal. Doctors in the UK now are realizing that a lot of the new COVID strains actually are primarily intestinal. There are less other symptoms, but more intestinal symptoms. So if you get sick and you have any intestinal symptoms like diarrhea, etc., take charcoal. Now, away from your other medications. You don't want the charcoal to inactivate your medications as well. So you want to take them at least 2-3 hours away from other medications. And so that's a very powerful, simple remedy as well. But so I would never demean or embarrass somebody who's had the vaccine. I mean, we all did the best we could based on the information we had. And the reason I'm being so forthright about this, okay, is not because I want to get on my high horse, and my soapbox and talk about people who had it wrong. I hate being a contrarian, but I have a passion to do what's right. Why? Because people are still at risk. Okay, what about the drug problem across the border right now? Should we just say, come on, let's just get over it? Oh, yeah, sure, they're still bringing drugs across the border, and more people are dying every day because of that. But come on, let's just get past it and stop blaming people for it. I mean, it's really a ridiculous argument. The problem with these vaccines is that they're causing so much premature death, okay, and disability, okay, that we need to focus on what actually works. And so when somebody says, come on, Wes, and I've been at panel discussions before, they're going, come on, let's get past this. No, people are at risk because of these type of therapies. Plus, they're making people think that they're protected when they're not protected at all. It's actually, they're even more likely to have various conditions. So that's why I'm speaking passionately about this. We need to have more and more health professionals, public health specialists, doctors to say this. Okay, and as long as people, if anybody trusts you, I'm talking to my fellow colleagues and doctors out there right now. If people actually trust you, then you need to come out and tell them what you know to be true. Because if you don't, then I'm sorry, blood's on your hands. Okay, because I'm sick of hearing more and more people dying all the time. I spoke at a church recently, about a month ago, and it was on Alzheimer's disease. And I literally spoke for 7 hours that weekend. Okay, and not one person ever asked. We had like 3 hours of Q&A. Not one person asked about the vaccine. So I just, for whatever reason, I never brought it up. I didn't bring it up I didn't avoid it on purpose. It just never came up. And 2 weeks later, I have a patient come in for the first time who has a level of dementia, and he says, I want to be treated for this. And so we're starting the program. And part of my checklist is I asked them how they did with COVID and what their decision was on the COVID vaccine. He goes like, oh, well, I did the initial 2. And I didn't do any boosters for a long time, but I just went to my doctor 2 days ago and he said, hey, you should get the vaccine. So I did it. And I realized I actually talked to that gentleman 2 weeks before. And if I'd mentioned to him what I know to be true, he wouldn't have done it. Okay, so we have a responsibility to speak out about this because people are being affected. My people perish for a lack of knowledge. Okay, and that's not going to be on my head right now, hopefully.
I highly respect that approach. And I think listeners, viewers now know why I appreciate Dr. Youngberg and what the Lord is doing through this health ministry and this truth-telling ministry. Jeremy, you read my mind. Let's talk to folks. Sammy, you're welcome. We love him too. Dr. Youngberg, you're appreciated by our viewers. Thanks for joining us, Sammy. Jamel says, I had coronavirus for 87 days. For weeks, I could not sleep. When I try to sleep or breathe softly under my breath, I feel, and I think this is present tense, feel like something blocking my airflow. Dr. Youngberg, what do you have to say to Jamel?
Here's the number one strategy. First of all, get your vitamin D optimized if you haven't already. So vitamin D takes about a week to convert to the active form so that it actually prevents damage and prevents cytokine storm. So what kills people is not the virus. It's the cytokine storm, the inflammatory burst that occurs about a week to 10 days after the virus begins replicating. So it's an exaggerated immune response against the condition that comes, basically too late, that actually causes the person's death. And so the key is, if we have enough vitamin D on board, then we're even though there's a little bit of that cytokine storm that occurs, it's basically controlled so well that it's not going to cause death or even serious illness. So that's number one. But when there's a respiratory illness, my big thing, and one of the other things, Scott, that we gave out to individuals at our church to help them, they basically build their emergency home-based medical kit for viral illness, so they can do true early intervention right away, in addition to the natural remedies that we talked about in the hydrotherapy. And that is, number one, that we use iodine. And so there's all there. I have a basically show the link. I have this on my Rumble channel. I have a full hour presentation on all the different uses of iodine for respiratory infections and your different options and how to do it properly. This is critical. Dr. McCullough has pointed out there's really good studies demonstrating this. Now, I presented this in February of 2020 as one of the main strategies without any studies showing that but we had dozens of studies showing that it killed every other virus. So why not? Why not do that? Okay, so we now know that it works extremely well, and just basically 4 times a day using, like I have it right here in front of me. Here's a liquid iodine bottle with a snoot cap on it. Okay, so it's a vertical cap, just sprayed up into the sinus a couple times each place, and it'll basically knock out any virus in the sinuses. Now, the best way to do this is make sure you have both a portable nebulizer and you have a mechanical nebulizer, like a tabletop nebulizer. Have both, because sometimes the portable nebulizers will gum up easily. They don't work as well. But if you get a good tabletop compressor, then you can basically add different types of iodine and nebulize it properly. Now, only nebulize nutritional-based forms of iodine, which is most iodine except povidone. Povidone or betadine, which is one of the povidone iodines, should not be nebulized. You can swish it and gargle it and spit it out. You can squirt it into your sinuses, but do not swallow betadine or povidone iodine, even when it's majorly diluted, like what we recommend. So if you watch my video on rumble.com on iodine, you'll get all the information that you need for that. And if you have issues with an infection, okay, you should be nebulizing at least twice a day, and if necessary, every couple hours until that is resolved. Just keep doing it. You're muted.
Jeremy, who else do we have on deck? We're out of time. So actually having a light audience on the live, I know we get a couple thousand views of these. Folks, share this. If you're watching this after the fact, most of the folks do. And Sammy, thanks for being here live. And Jamel, and spread the word. We're always here 5:45 p.m. Eastern time. Lewin, thanks for being here. Greetings to you. And Mick, hello from Broken Bow, Oklahoma. I think we're going to have Dr. Youngberg back to do diabetes and cognitive. I know the majority of his practice these days is cognitive health. Watching from Southwest Florida, welcome. Mercy from Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. Thanks for being here, Mercy. And Diana, welcome. Gives us an amen. Josh can't wait to listen on his way home. Thanks for sharing. Josh must have joined late. Glad you get to catch it on the archive. And you're welcome, Sammy. So we have to wrap up. And every one of you, thank you for being here live. And those who watch later, we really appreciate every one of our viewers. Share this link. And really thanks again, Dr. Youngberg. Really informative, very helpful. And I just appreciate and praise God for the strength and clarity that he has given to you through these difficult years. And I hope folks sit up and take notice and see an example in that way that Christ has shown. So thanks to our producer, Christian Digital Network, from likes to lives change. Please scan the QR code, subscribe to CDN YouTube channel, and we'll see you all next week, 5:45 p.m. Eastern, with Dylan McWilliams. Miracle stories from the mission front line in Ukraine. Amazing, amazing show we're going to have next week. God bless each one of you, and we'll see you next time.